Welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 233rd episode, our guest is Thom Hartmann. Thom Hartmann is a progressive, nationally and internationally syndicated talk show host. Talkers magazine named him America's #1 most important progressive host and the host of one of the top 10 talk radio shows in the country every year for more than a decade. A 4-time recipient of the Project Censored Award, Hartmann is also a New York Times-bestselling author of more than 30 books, translated into multiple languages. He was born in Michigan and retains strong ties to the Midwest, although he has lived in many regions. He now lives on the Columbia River in Portland, Oregon. And now on to the show.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you, Rob?
Good. I have 4 children, so I was just in the process of getting them all to bed, so I apologize for the delayed start here. So.
Best excuse there is.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time this evening. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah. For people that don't know who you are, would you mind going ahead and just introducing yourself to start with?
Yeah, I do a talk show Monday through Friday, and I write books. And I also write a daily column over at HartmannReport.com.
Great. Yeah, and I've been reading your book here, The Hidden History of American Democracy. Could you talk just a little bit about what inspired this book and why you decided to write this, especially now?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of myths about democracy itself, about how America became this, grand experiment, after arguably 3,000 years since the Greek experiment, the failure of the Greek experiment with democracy. Thanks in no small part to Aristotle, and what it means and where it came from, and why democracy, and what the founders, what their understanding of how our system of government was supposed to be, and so I wanted to get into that, and thus wrote the book.
I really think it's a very interesting subject to tackle, especially now, because I feel like the extreme right really takes ownership of that founding father period, and they don't really see any nuance in that whole equation. And obviously in your book you delve pretty deeply into why that's not so. There's so many examples we could start with. I'm thinking of the Jefferson Bible for one thing, and maybe we could start with the influence of Native Americans on all of this and the thinking behind the system of government they wanted to set up in the first place.
Yeah, what most of us learned, who took history or civics classes that involved or included the founding of this country, was that the founders and the framers of the Constitution, probably more significantly, were inspired by the Greek democracy and the Roman Republic. Or at the very least that they derived their inspiration from the writers of the Enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes in the 1600s, John Locke in the early 1700s, or maybe the 1670s, as I recall, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Denis Diderot, these folks who's Montesquieu, these names that are familiar, from high school for many people. But it turns out that there was this fad in France in the 1600s and through the mid 1700s, well, actually all throughout the 18th century. There was mostly wealthy women who would conduct what they called salons. They would invite people into their homes. They would invite a famous speaker, and then a bunch of the local intelligentsia and politicians and whatnot, and the speaker would speak, and then sometimes the conversations about that would last for days in some cases, and there were the French had very successfully penetrated the region of the Midwest, basically from Michigan over to New York State and down into the Ohio area and up to the Canadian border. Mostly, they were looking for fur. They're mostly French trappers, but along with them came a bunch of Jesuits, a bunch of French priests who were committed to evangelizing the Native Americans, and the Native Americans were this is mostly the Huron tribe. Were it's okay with us. They were fine with it. So as a result, from the late 1600s through the mid 1700s, for about a 60-year period, there were these kind of annual letters, and they were published heavily in France and in multiple other languages from these French evangelists, these priests, telling about the nature and quality and of the governance and of the lives of these native people, and more often than not, with great admiration. That there are no rich, there are no poor, there are no jails, there are no police, and yet they live in peace. The leaders are the ones with the least power. They are there to serve. In the Iroquois Confederacy and 4 out of the 5 original nations, only the women had a vote, essentially, for the sachems, for the leadership roles, although those were filled by men. And that then led to a number of these Native Americans becoming quite fluent in French and traveling over to Paris and participating in these salons. And, Voltaire, Locke, we don't have a specific example of Hobbes, but certainly Diderot, certainly Rousseau, all attended these things or knew of these people and read these works extensively and were very, very impressed by them. And the basic message of the Native Americans was, we've been doing this for 10,000 years in the North American continent or longer, and we've kind of through trial and error figured it out. And if you let people accumulate too much stuff, if you allow greed, and if you let people take positions of power and then just arbitrarily, capriciously exercise that power, you're going to have really unhappy people. You're going to have a miserable life. You're going to have a terrible community. And instead, if you allow most decision-making, certainly consequential decision-making, to be made by consensus or by at least majority rule, and if your leadership roles are actually subordinate roles, they're servant roles, and if you have a society where everybody's everybody's there to support everybody else, and if you openly ostracize people who try to accumulate wealth, then you can have a very good society. And they wrote and spoke some just absolutely brilliant critiques of the French king system, the French political system, including after the French Revolution, although almost all of this was pre-French Revolution. And those were the people, these Native Americans were the people who were informing these great Enlightenment philosophers, who then were supposedly the source of information for, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and John Adams and Ben Franklin and, George Mason, the names we recognize. In fact, virtually all of those Americans knew these Native Americans well. John Adams had very, very close friends who were Native Americans that stayed at his home. Thomas Jefferson, his father was a map maker in Virginia, and he traveled all over the state in the early 1700s and brought his son with him. Jefferson's father, Peter, died when he was 15, I believe, and when Thomas was 15. And spoke multiple Native American languages. And again, there were a number of them. Onisset, probably the most well-known, who Jefferson actually got to know quite well. And Jefferson, at the age of 17, was at the ceremony where Onisset was preparing to get on a ship and go to England to negotiate with King George II over treaty violations that the American settlers were doing. So, the kind of bottom line here, Rob, is that it turns out we didn't get our ideas from Greece. I mean, Greece was a pure democracy, more or less, and it was run kind of by jury duty, basically. If you didn't show up, it took 6,001 people to create a body, and you were drawn by lot. If you didn't show up, you were called an idiota, which is where the word idiot comes from. And we didn't get it from the Roman Republic. They had sort of a quasi-democracy for the first little bit, but it very rapidly turned into just another kingdom, another empire. It really came from the Native Americans. And then, later on, we learned that African tribes were operating the same way. Aboriginal people in Australia were operating the same way. South American tribes. Some great research just in the last 2 weeks. It was published in Nature in Mesoamerica, where they found, they've just in the last year, this is not in my book, but, they found that the Mesoamerican communities, the Central American communities that clearly did not have hierarchical power or wealth, that were run as kind of little communist societies, essentially, or really little democracies, were far more resilient when it came to war, disease, and drought, and worked out very well. Whereas the little kingdom ones, the from the Aztecs and the Mayans down to the smaller communities that were imitating them, were very fragile. Because the decision making was by one individual or a small group of people. They were run as kingdoms or kleptocracies or oligarchies, and they were not as resilient. They did not last as long, and they did not function as well. So I think I've gone on longer than I should have on that.
That's fine. I love it. But I feel like it's like, to go back to this point, it's just I live in Hamilton County, Indiana, which just made news recently for the Moms for Liberty group here, using a Hitler quote on their newsletter, in case you caught that.
I did.
News. Yeah. So that's where I'm at. And so I see them being like, taking on the mantle of, this is a Christian nation, and, all this and that and the third. It's so frustrating, because the founders, for the most part, absolutely did not want this to be a Christian nation. I mean, Patrick Henry, exception to the rule, of course, but just talk a little bit about how much disdain John Adams, just go down the line. You don't even have to look that far. George Washington, none of these people are championing the idea of a theocracy, but they seem to want to perpetuate that. They don't seem to. They are perpetuating that.
Yeah, they're trying to create one, and certainly the Supreme Court is really working hard at that. But yeah, to say anything about the founders generally is like saying something about today's politics. I mean, even in the Federalist and anti-Federalist circles, which later kind of more or less became the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, there were differences of opinion. But one of the few things that there was broad agreement on, with the exception of Patrick Henry, as you mentioned, the fellow who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," ironically, was the largest holder of enslaved human beings in the state of Virginia, and a brutal slave holder, and an evangelical Christian, and he used his Christianity to justify his slaveholding. But he was so ostracized for that he ultimately did not sign the Constitution. He spoke against the Constitution at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, talked James Madison into modifying the Second Amendment to protect the slave patrol, but that was as far as he was willing to go. Jefferson and Washington were both deists. They believed that some creator created the universe and set everything in motion according to mechanical, natural laws. When Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he said, nature's God demands, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, essentially. These are the rules of nature and nature's God. And John Adams, who was a Christian, scratched that out and said Christian God, and because he did the first edit of the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson scratched out Adams's scratch out and took it back to nature's God, which is where it still is to this day. Because he and Franklin, who was also a deist, believed that nature and God were pretty much the same thing. They looked around themselves and were filled with awe and thought, that's it. We don't need books. We don't need priests. We don't need preachers. And even John Adams, who was a Christian, and James Madison, who was a Christian, agreed that government and church should remain very, very separate. Adams, who was Jefferson's protege, had this running debate with Jefferson over the course of decades. in which in which Madison, the father of the Constitution, he's about 20 years younger than Jefferson, as I recall. He was the president who followed Jefferson. Jefferson was president from 1801 to 1809, and then Madison came in 1810 or 1809. Madison was convinced that if the government ever started giving money to the churches, it would corrupt the church. It would corrupt the pastors. They would turn into political creatures, and it would destroy the religion that he loved. Madison went to church every Sunday. John Adams went to church every Sunday and took notes. And sometimes he'd go to 2 or 3 church services on a single day. He was really into his Christianity. And John Adams, you'll read some of the correspondence between Adams and Jefferson in my book. Adams also felt that if the government ever started, supporting religion in any way, that the great risk was that religion would no longer be pure, would no longer be independent, that Christianity would become, just another political force. Jefferson, on the other hand, was convinced, he didn't really think, that was that big a deal, but he was convinced that if a religious figure, if a priest or a preacher, he referred to them as priests, kind of a generic reference back then. It wasn't specifically about Catholics. But nonetheless, he felt that if a priest ever became a president or a senator or even a member of the House of Representatives, that it would cause great corruption to the American democracy. And in other words, if religion ever inserted itself into government. So that was Jefferson's concern. Madison's concern was government inserting itself into religion. And it turns out they were both right. It was both right. Mm-hmm. So, and George Washington, one of the first treaties that America signed outside of the treaties with the Native Americans was with a group of Muslims on the Barbary coast, the Barbary pirates. And it's referred to as the Treaty of Tripoli. George Washington negotiated it and wrote it. Actually, Alexander Hamilton probably wrote it because he did most of Washington's writing for him. He was his secretary, Jefferson was Secretary of State. He was Secretary of the Treasury. But in any case, he was also kind of Washington's number 2 guy. And in that treaty, it says, as America is not in any way created on the foundation of Christian theology, and then goes on to say we have no fight with the Muslims, with you guys. John Adams signed that treaty. It was negotiated during the Washington presidency, but it wasn't finalized until the Adams presidency. So, there was absolute unanimity, at least among those who became president, about this, at least right up through the 1830s. So, the people who are pushing religion now in our schools and in government are ahistoric. They are essentially spitting on the graves of the founders of this country. Mm-hmm.
You've thought about the founders a lot, obviously, and I just want to know what you make of this originalist idea that the Supreme Court seems to be going with here lately with their supermajority. Because at a certain point, I don't know, does it matter what these founding fathers thought? It's been so long and they couldn't have possibly predicted everything, that's been happening now. So I appreciate what you're doing. You're really giving a lot of good perspective on the founders, but sometimes I'm just like, man, I don't care what they thought about the guns. They couldn't have possibly, for example, they couldn't have possibly conceived of what a gun could look like today. You know what I mean? It wasn't even.
They didn't even have bullets back then. They had
yeah, right. So I don't know. I appreciate what you're doing, but it's are you playing into their game by justifying it and then buying into the idea that we have to look at what the founders were doing? At a certain point, I don't really care what they were doing. Is it right? Is it wrong? That's what I'm more concerned about.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that we should.
Yeah.
And in fact, you'll find in the book, a rather lengthy quote from Thomas Jefferson, where he said that every generation should reinvent America. He said to do anything less, to consider the Constitution to be some rigid thing, would be the equivalent of requiring a man to wear the clothes that he wore as a child for the rest of his life. And so, no, I'm not suggesting that, we should be guided by the founders' perspectives. What I'm trying to do is push back on those people who are making that claim and point out that even if, that should be what we do, that they're full of crap, basically. They're lying to us, and they know it. Many of them know it. So, yeah, with regard to originalism in general, this is the scam that, Scalia came up with 20 years ago on the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
And it's complete BS to think that any judge on the Supreme Court can read the minds of the founding generation when there was such diversity of opinion among them on most issues, is absurd. And, so this whole originalism thing and Neil Gorsuch's textualism is nothing more than a fig leaf to cover up the fact that these Republicans on the Supreme Court, the Democrats have never bought into the originalist scam, that the Republicans on the Supreme Court are basically political actors. They're rewriting laws, which, by the way, is a power that is not given to the Supreme Court in the Constitution, and striking down laws, another power that is not given to the Supreme Court in the Constitution, in ways that, would infuriate the founders. In fact, in 1803, in the Marbury versus Madison decision, when the Supreme Court first took upon itself the power to strike down a law, it struck down a provision in the Judiciary Act of 1797. In this dispute between James Madison, Secretary of State James Madison, and a fellow who was supposed to get an officer's commission, Mr. Marbury. In that case, when John Marshall, who was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, who had been put on the court by John Adams, at that point, in 1801, Adams and Jefferson were bitter enemies, because 2 years earlier, when Jefferson was vice president, Adams was president. Adams had passed the Alien Sedition Acts and put 18 newspaper editors and publishers in prison and shut down 25 newspapers, and including the Aurora, which was run by Ben Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bach. And Jefferson walked out of the White House that day when that law was signed and never went back. For the next 2 years, he was vice president and didn't once speak to or see, in fact, didn't physically see John Adams for the rest of his life. They reconciled as old men in a series of letters, but that was about it. So bottom line, when well, just to tie up one story about the religion thing, to go back to that just real quickly. James Madison, when he became president, the first veto he issued was Patrick Henry's faction was becoming ascendant by 1809 in Congress, and George Washington had created funding for a poorhouse in Washington, D.C., and they wanted to run the money through a local church, and that was Madison's veto. But anyhow, when the Supreme Court took this power onto themselves in the Marbury decision, Thomas Jefferson was president of the United States in 1803, and he went absolutely nuts. He said, if this decision stands, then the Constitution has become a thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary. Not only are they acting like kings, but they are the unelected body of government. They should be the last to say what the law is. These are laws that are created by Congress and signed by the president, who are elected by the people. The court has no business doing this. He was furious about it, as was much of the nation. There was so much blowback against John Marshall. And I went off on a digression about John Adams when I mentioned John Marshall, because Adams appointed John Marshall just a week before Thomas Jefferson became president. It was a lame duck appointment. Marshall was Jefferson's second cousin, and they hated each other. He was a high Federalist. He was what today you would call a MAGA conservative. So anyhow, the court didn't do that again in any consequential way. I mean, they tried it a couple of times, during the Andrew Jackson presidency in the 1830s. The Supreme Court said that the Second National Bank of America was constitutional and President Jackson should leave it alone, and he killed it. He shot it down anyway. And then in the Trail of Tears, they said it was unconstitutional for him to uproot the Cherokee and move them to Oklahoma. That was a case that extended beyond Jackson's presidency, but Jackson said, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. In other words, screw you, Supreme Court. And he completely ignored them. But anyhow, the next big case, the next time the Supreme Court did this was in 1856 in Dred Scott versus Sanford. And Abraham Lincoln basically said, that's terrible for poor Mr. Scott. He's got to go back to being a slave in Missouri, but I'm not going to enforce this on anybody else in America. So, here you had the Supreme Court routinely being ignored or defied by American presidents, including Abraham Lincoln. Jackson's not quite as noble a figure. And called out by Thomas Jefferson for doing this, for saying that they know the proper meaning of the Constitution and they're going to modify our laws to comport with that. And, they don't. And, but that's basically all they do now. I mean, this court, 100 years ago, the court might have 2 or 3 decisions a year based on the Constitution. And every other decision was, they were the final court of appeals. Decisions would go back and forth through appeals courts. But, the buck had to end somewhere. And that was the Supreme Court. Nowadays, all they're doing is just rewriting our laws in ways that are completely inconsistent with the Constitution, and frankly, pissing off a lot of Americans.
Yeah, and I just always think it's like what the originalists thought. Basically, they're saying that history kind of ended with the founders and we should just look to them. But what about stare decisis? What about settled law? What about the last 50 years of Roe v. Wade? Okay, you can say what you want, but that's a precedent. Like people have, that's longer than I've been alive, like, where's that?
It's like I said, it's BS. And not particularly well-crafted BS.
No, it's pure power play for sure.
Yep.
Wow. But what lessons do you think we can take from this period going forward here? It just seems like we're going backwards now because with going back to the Supreme Court, I think liberals especially got used to the Supreme Court granting rights, and now we're seeing them systematically being stripped away by that same body that they were complacent on, so many times. But conservatives were not complacent. It was a 50-year project to get this done. And now it's, for the rest of my natural life, it's probably going to be all wonky unless the Democrats step up and do what needs to be done for reform, Yeah,
and hopefully they will. But it's going to take a hell of a majority, and that's going to depend on us in the 2024 election. What was your question?
I don't think I had a question. It was just a burst of anger. I'm sorry.
Well, then let me just riffle, to that point. The reason why I think it's important that we understand what the founders did is because they created a democracy in a Western society that for 7,000 years had been kingdoms, warlord kings and nobles and rich people and kleptocracies and whatnot. And the reason why that's important is because it turns out democracy is the default mode for pretty much all animal life on Earth. I tell the story in the book about these 2 scientists at the University of Essex, Kent Conrad and I forget his initials, but Dr. Roper. I interviewed Conrad. And they put forward this hypothesis that all decision-making in animals, in animal communities, would most likely turn out to be small d democratic rather than, dictatorial. We have these stories about alpha animals, and you see the elk, smashing their horns against each other and bears fighting with each other and all that kind of stuff. And you think, okay, there's got to be an alpha animal that runs everything, sort of like the president runs the country, or the CEO runs the company. But it turns out, and it turns out that there are alpha animals, and there are hierarchies like that, but they're purely limited to sexual selection. The alpha animal gets first choice of sexual mate, which, in a Darwinian sense makes sense. As the strongest, they probably have the best genes, and so that there's some logic there. But their argument was that any kind of decision outside of sexual selection is made democratically. So James Randerson and a group of scientists at the university and working with New Scientist magazine did a study of this with a group of red deer in the forest near the university, putting cameras in the trees and whatnot and tracking the deer and trying to figure out, how do they decide? They're all out grazing in the field or in the forest, and at some point they got to go to a watering hole, and there's 3 watering holes, and how do they know which one to go to, and how do they know when to go there, and who makes the decision? And what they found was that throughout the time that and these are important decisions, by the way. If they go too soon, everybody doesn't get the nutrients they need. If they go too late, the older or younger animals might get dehydrated and could even die. So, or get weakened or, more vulnerable to predators. And so what they found was that as the animals were eating, they would start aligning themselves, their bodies, toward a particular watering hole. And when 50% plus 1 of the animals had pointed their heads at one particular watering hole, the entire herd, literally within moments, would form into a herd and head to that one watering hole. So when I asked Kent Conrad about this and said, what happened when you published this result? And he said, I got a call from a fish guy, the ichthyologist, and if you've ever seen a school of fish swimming along, and they're just kind of going along, and then all of a sudden the whole school of fish just takes a right turn and goes like that. And how do they do that, right? I mean, I always assumed they were telepathic, frankly. But it turns out that every fin beat, as it were, is a vote. And when more than 51% of the fish are moving 3 degrees to the right, suddenly the whole school of fish moves 3 degrees to the right. He heard from an ornithologist, a bird guy, who was saying, and we've seen the same things with birds, with flocking birds. The flock flies around, and it seems to have a group intelligence. And the way it is every single wing beat is a vote. And when 51% of the animals are moving in a particular direction, the entire flock moves in that direction. Everybody. He heard from a bug guy, an entomologist, who said that I'm seeing the same thing with gnats, balls of gnats in the air that just kind of move around in the summer. It's like, how do they know where to be and how to move? Well, they're voting with their wings, with every wing beat. He heard from an ant guy, he heard from a gorilla guy, another primatologist. Basically, every animal that you can find. There are a couple of exceptions of animals that are just entirely solitary. They're very few and far between. But outside of that, every animal that has any social instinct at all governs themselves through small d democracy. And so when the founders put this thing together, this democracy thing together, they were bringing humans into line with basically all other animal life on Earth, which was the argument that the Native Americans were making when they went to these French salons. And so that's why I think it's so important, and that they were clear about this, by the way. It's why Thomas Jefferson had this fight with John Adams about nature's God in the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, that's more hopeful than I can get a lot of the time. I feel like I get kind of cynical, so that's a better way of looking at things. I think that's more hopeful.
Well, it's why I think our democracy has prevailed for 240 years. The problem is it has cancer right now. I mean, the Supreme Court in 1978, in a decision written by Lewis Powell himself, the author of the Powell Memo, ruled that corporations are persons and entitled to rights under the Bill of Rights, and one of those rights is the First Amendment right of free speech, and that money isn't really money is speech, and that lubricated Ronald Reagan's ascent into office in 1980 and the Reagan Revolution. The court doubled down on it in 2010 with Citizens United. And so now we've got this poison of big right-wing billionaire money, and money from outside the country. In fact, in 2010, in Citizens United, they actually legalized foreign money in our elections. And so we now have an electoral system that has been badly corrupted by money, and it really is a cancer in our democracy. And I point that out in the book too. I mean, this needs to be one of the very first things we do, is excise that cancer.
couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. We're getting to the end of our time here, and I thank you so much for taking the time. I hope you come back sometime. It's been such a pleasure talking with you. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been an honor and a pleasure for me, Rob. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No problem. Before you go, though, the last question I always ask is, what music have you been listening to lately?
Oh, geez. George Winston, actually.
Nice.
I listen to George Winston when I write.
That's good. Good answer. I like that. Great. Well, everyone should, yeah, go on.
I said, I think he just recently passed away. It's kind of a
Oh,
loss.
really? Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, but brilliant pianist.
Nice. Well, thank you again, and please come back sometime. I really appreciate it. So
My pleasure.
great. Well, have a good night. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, you too.